Hi, everyone, and welcome to Tell Me About Podcast, where each week two nerdy friends deep dive random topics. I'm Laura.
And I'm Tom.
And this is episode number 30.
So we want to just update everyone on a couple things. As you know, we're now in that portion of the schedule where we said we're going to be doing episodes every other week. That's going to be continuing up until the end of May into early June. We try to get episodes out as quickly as we can, but there are going to be times during the year where we're going to have to, kind of just get episodes out when we can. Now, part of what we've been doing over the last couple of weeks is we've been getting the YouTube page up and running. We are very excited. We have a couple episodes, full episodes up there now. We have some shorts up there as well. You can find it through the TikTok. You can find it through our Instagram. It's also at youtube.com/the Tell Me About Podcast. So please subscribe, rate us. Again, we're excited about what we put up on the YouTube page so far, and we're excited about growing that part of it. So, Laura, are you ready for this week's episode?
I am. This is definitely an interesting topic, something that I know a little bit about, but that I have a lot of questions about. So I'm ready to get into it.
So this week we're going to be talking about something that you might have heard of, you may not, but it's from where Laura and I live. It's kind of an urban legend that's actually real. And this is the story of the Centralia, Pennsylvania mine fire, a mining town that now is a literal ghost town. Let's start by just discussing the actual town of Centralia itself. So Centralia is a town in northeastern Pennsylvania. It was originally a Native American settlement until the indigenous people of northeastern Pennsylvania, the tribe, sold it to the British colonists for about 500 pounds. This is back in the 1700s. That's how America was founded, folks, unfortunately.
How close is it to Scranton?
It's about 70 miles southwest of Scranton. So this is right smack in the middle of coal country, specifically anthracite coal.
I always had a question about that. Do you know what the difference is between like regular coal and anthracite coal?
Luckily for you, I took a class in college about Pennsylvania coal.
That was an option?
It was the history and geology of Pennsylvania coal. It was a half class. They split the semester into two. Half the semester was about the actual chemical composition of the coal, and the other half was the social aspect, so like the unionization and company towns and all of that. I did horribly on the science part, but I did great on the history part.
I was going to say, do you use any of that information today?
I mean, some of it's from memory, but basically it was a liberal arts class for the science majors, and it was a science class for the liberal arts majors. So
Gotcha.
It was whatever you needed it to be. So anthracite coal, and this is from the USGS, says the definition is, it is a hard, brittle, and black lustrous coal containing a high percentage of fixed carbon and a low percentage of volatile matter. So it has the highest carbon content, the fewest impurities, and the highest energy density. So it's extremely valuable.
I have no idea what any of that means.
There's no filler. There's not a lot of filler, meaning you're basically you can basically get pure energy out of it. So in the 1800s, people start to realize that there is anthracite coal below Centralia, as there was in most of eastern and northeastern Pennsylvania. So that's how you start founding these company towns. The history of the company, now Centralia is not necessarily a company town, but the company towns have a pretty negative connotation, and with rightfully so. I mean, these were there's a lot of towns that exist today because they were set up as literally they were owned by the mining company. The only people that lived there were mine workers and their families. They shopped at company stores, and they were paid essentially in company dollars. If you ever gone to the Disney store and they gave you Disney dollars, imagine that being your salary, having to use that money to buy groceries at the company store.
I always thought, or at least I hoped, that there was good intention behind these company towns, but to me, it just seems like very monopolistic and isolating for the people, right?
That was essentially it. I mean, they were cut off from everyone, and they were monopolistic by design. It was built that way because they wanted people there to just be completely dependent on mining and completely dependent on the company. Now, there's a whole history about Centralia going into the 1800s and 1900s. There's a pretty infamous incident involving the Molly Maguires, which is a very famous Irish gang, mob, however you want to call it, that basically kind of the antagonist to the mining companies. There's a whole nother podcast we can do about the Molly Maguires and the Pinkertons, because the Pinkertons were extremely involved in enforcing the company towns and trying to union bust and things like that. That's all, that also gets into the Western Pennsylvania steel industry. The life of a mine worker was not glamorous. It was hard work, it was dangerous, and quite frankly, it was short. The life expectancy of a mine worker was 30s, 40s. You started working when you were maybe 16, 17. You worked in the mines, and then, you died a really painful death from black lung and all the fumes that were down there.
Now, coal work is it's generational, right?
Pretty much. I mean, because you had whole families that basically had a whole lineage working in the mines. Again, it was thankless work for not a lot of pay and hazardous. The fumes were kind of the silent killer. The fumes, the gases, the dust, that was a silent killer. You also at that point had to deal with fires. You had to deal with mine collapses. You had to deal with suffocation. This is where you got the term the canary in the coal mine. Because if something happened to the canary, that means there's a problem. So, when they would open and build these mines, eventually there had to be some sort of safety protocol. There had to be more than one way in or out of the mine. There had to be escape routes, because otherwise, if there's only one way out and the mine were to collapse behind you, you're trapped, which is extremely, I can't even imagine. When I was in Arizona recently, I did a tour of a mine, and I can't even imagine being trapped there with no way out.
That's like instant panic attack right there.
It's akin to, like, if you ever seen the people that like to cave, like to go through the really narrow caves. Just thinking, I can't even imagine doing that in a mine with hazardous chemicals. So you had to have multiple escape routes. You had to have ventilation. Couldn't have people working in dark, confined spaces with dust and chemical. Because a lot of this, as we got onto the later years, they weren't just chipping the coal out; they were blasting it out. I don't necessarily know if they did blasting here. And the other thing too was that these mines were not necessarily a reservoir. When you think of a mine, it's not just like a big open area where there's just one point where you're getting the coal out of.
Do they have any regulations around the air vents, or it was just...
There weren't really regulations around the vents itself. You have to remember 1800s, early 1900s, it's very pro-employer. Now, by the 1950s, what Pennsylvania had done, because Pennsylvania, a lot of the economy in Pennsylvania, especially in the 1800s, was built on mining and natural material. But as mines would get abandoned, they would become landfills. And literally, they would just become trash dumps. So Pennsylvania was very concerned about illegal dumping at abandoned mines. We'll get into the reason why later, because it's very important to the story. What I was getting at as well is, when you think of a mine, it's not just like just one central area where you're digging, where you're chiseling or whatever. There's veins that go out in all different directions. It's like roots on a tree. It's spreading out in all different. It's like it's like arteries in the body, arteries and veins in the body. It's going out in all different There may be one central location, but it's going out in all different directions. And this was to try and maximize the yield of what you were getting out of the mine, but also too, these were part of the escape routes. Ironically, this all kind of led to disaster inadvertently. With that, we take a huge fast forward to May of 1962, and the town of Centralia is discussing what to do about Memorial Day. And part of what they want to do on Memorial Day is they want to clean up the landfill. This landfill is basically a 300-foot wide, 75-foot long pit that was made up in part of a 50-foot deep strip mine that had been cleared by Edward Whitney in 1935. This was an abandoned mine that had now become an illegal dumping ground. There were about 8 illegal dumps in Centralia in May of 1962. And Pennsylvania was very, very concerned about, as I mentioned before, they were very, very concerned about illegal dumping. Specifically, they were concerned about fires because all these strip mines had to have air vents, air pockets. What they were afraid of was trash could catch fire. And trash fires specifically could linger and burn longer than normal. It could also then, if it burned longer than normal, it could then basically travel down these air vents and ignite the coal. And then you have a major problem. So Pennsylvania actually enacted a legislation that basically said if you abandon the strip mine and you're dumping garbage there, you have to fill these air holes, these air vents, with material that can't catch fire. Basically won't give the fire an oxygen feed to burn and grow. If you notice, if there's like a trash fire, it's not as simple as just putting a lid on it. It can burn for a long time. If you've ever seen a trash fire, it can burn for a shitload of a long time. Basically, so with that, we go back to 1962. The town council is trying to decide what they're going to do about this landfill. Basically, the Pennsylvania law had not only said that you had to be able to use these pits as landfills, you had to fill the air vents with material, but you also had to inspect it regularly, and you need a permit to use these abandoned mines as landfills. This is where the story kind of diverges. So in May of 1962, the town council allegedly decides that they are going to clean up this landfill by setting the garbage on fire. It's supposed to be a controlled trash fire. In fact, the legend tells it that the volunteer fire company was actually paid to watch the fire and put it out.
So the key word there being controlled.
Controlled. Supposed to. Now, the minutes from that meeting were never made public. And that was in part because doing these kind of cleanup trash fires on abandoned mines was illegal.
So the dumping of the trash was illegal, but putting out the fires was also illegal.
No, setting the fires. You couldn't have dump fires because again, like we said before, trash fires are not easy to put out. You could douse it with water, and then once it dries out, it could start again. You kind of think of it like a forest fire, so to speak, in that you could wet it, but then the second it dries out, it's going to rekindle again. So there's conflicting reports on whether or not the town actually approved the controlled dump fire. But what we know is that the fire was ignited on May 27th, 1962, and the fire company then doused the visible flames with water. However, the flames then started up again on May 29th. Those flames were put out, but then there was another flare-up on June 4th. They had to keep, every time they would put it out, it would keep rekindling. This is also happening in the middle of summer when it's hot out and it's sunny. So you can kind of see where this is going.
And can I just say, though, can you imagine the smell of this was probably horrific?
Like garbage stinks as it is. Now imagine setting it on fire.
Not good.
The sweet smell of garbage wafting through the air.
And I'm sure that you could smell it for miles, depending on how big it was.
Absolutely. When they're called back out the second time to put out this fire, the fire company uses a bulldozer to basically turn the garbage to try and because basically what was happening is when they were putting out the fire, they were only putting out the top layer of it. There was so much garbage there that it was still burning underneath. So that's how it kept rekindling. That's why it's so hard to put out, because it's so thick that when you're putting it out, you're not really, you're just putting out the top of it. You're not actually dousing the fire. When they do the bulldozer, what they find is that there was a 15-foot wide hole, 7 feet tall hole that went from the surface of the pit into the mine. It had never been filled with incombustible material as per state law because there was literally too much garbage. The garbage had blocked the hole. That's how much garbage that was in there. And that's a problem because this hole led down to the abandoned mine. And in the weeks that followed, townspeople started to complain about foul odors from the smoldering trash, but also started to complain about smells and smoke coming up from the ground.
There it is.
And there it is. The coal underneath Centralia had caught fire.
Now, let me stop you at this point. So, when this first happened and they realized what was going on, what was the response from the town officials? Like, clearly, it doesn't sound like they accepted responsibility to this if there was some conflict over whether they approved this or not.
They did not, but they did try to remediate it. One of the there's a journalist named David Dekok, Dekok. He's written 2 books about Centralia. And one thing that he had spoken of, or one thing that he wrote in his first book, is that there were multiple attempts to try and first remediate the fire. So first there was a trucking company that had come in to try and remove the smoldering material from the mine. They brought in mine inspectors to basically measure the activity that was happening underneath, because by this point, there's steam from the coal rising up through the ground, through fissures in the north wall of the landfill pit. When they tested it, they found out that steam contained large traces of carbon monoxide, typical of coal mine fires. So this is not just steam and smoke that's rising up through the ground. It's carbon monoxide.
That'll kill you.
Carbon monoxide will kill you. Now imagine it literally rising up through the ground all over town.
That literally sounds like a nightmare.
It is. In August 1962, they make their first attempt to try and excavate the mine, to try and get the burning material out of the ground. Now, the problem was they didn't know where the fire was. They had steam coming up from out of the ground, but you had to first do exploratory drilling. You couldn't do exploratory drilling on a mine that's abandoned.
And this is because they didn't know where the source was.
Exactly. So basically, when they had their first attempt to try and excavate, they couldn't pinpoint the fire itself. In fact, they were only able to do it based on the amount of steam that was coming out of the landfill rock. Very scientific. Basically looking around, hey, there's a bunch of steam over there. Let's dig over there.
It almost felt like process of elimination to figure this out.
Yes. But what happened is when they breached the landfill wall to go down and try and find the fire, well, what happened? There's now a huge oxygen vent on one side of the landfill. What do fires love? Oxygen. If there might have been a small fire, guess what you just did now?
Now there's a big fire.
Now there's a big ass fucking fire. Not to mention, they were only able to work on weekdays and only working during the day.
Couldn't this be classified as some kind of like emergency situation where they could work like 24 hours around the clock in different shifts?
You would think, but instead they only worked 5 days a week, 8 hours a day. In fact, they actually took 5 days off for Labor Day.
But to me, that says that they weren't taking this seriously, right?
One of the big issues I found with my research is no one really took this seriously.
It just sounds like a clusterfuck from the beginning.
It really was. From the town basically dooming itself because they wanted to get rid of garbage from Memorial Day to at least one haphazard attempt to try and put it out. They then make a second attempt to try and excavate the mine and to try and put out the fire. This time, they're going to use water. They're going to try and pump water into the mines to try and douse it. Here's the problem with this. It was the end of November, early December, when they finally accepted the bids and they started the project.
It's going to freeze.
That's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
It was an unseasonably cold winter, and the water line froze stiff. Not to mention a snowy winter on top of that. They had at least one blizzard that basically froze the entire water line. Now, at this point, this is kind of just a local problem. I mean, obviously the state was aware of what was happening. The town had paid for these two excavation attempts by themselves. So the town has almost bankrupted itself, and it hasn't really done anything to put out the fire. By April 11th of the next year, you now have steam escaping from additional openings in the ground. Not only did both projects fail, the fire is spreading.
So yeah, it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
They make a third attempt to try and excavate. But that was delayed until after July 1st of 1963, so that it would start after the new fiscal year.
So wait, if I'm following the timeline correctly, so this started in May of 62, and this is a full year and 2 months later?
Yes.
Okay.
Basically, that goes nowhere. By the end of 1963, it's abandoned. We mentioned Mr. David before. He was a local reporter in Shamokin, PA, and he was really one of the only reporters covering this story. So he writes a number of over 500 articles between 1976 and 1986 about this mine fire.
This was like his entire profession was reporting on this.
Pretty much. As this all is going on, there's still about 1,500, 2,000 people living in the town.
Were the town residents aware of this and how obviously they could see the carbon monoxide coming up from the ground, but were they aware of how bad this was?
No.
Didn't think so.
You had 2,000 people still living and going about their lives. By 1979, he writes a story about a gas station owner who goes to check the fuel level in one of his fuel tanks. When he takes out his dipstick to measure the fuel level, he notices that the dipstick is red hot. He puts a thermometer into the ground, and he discovers that the temperature of the gasoline in the tank, in the fuel tank at the gas station, was 172 degrees Fahrenheit. So now the ground is getting hot.
I thought you were going to say that he exploded.
He's lucky he probably didn't, considering he was sitting on a fucking gas station. Not long after that in 1980, that people start having health problems. Because now, if you think about it, there's steam rising up from the ground all over the place. The town is basically sitting in a fog of carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and low oxygen. You start having adverse health problems, specifically breathing problems, reported to the state. While this is all going on, it's still not really a statewide story in Pennsylvania, and it's not really a national story. The national story doesn't come until a year later in 1981.
19 years after this starts, then it becomes national story.
This is a big part of the story. So we get to a young man called Todd Dombrowski. And on Valentine's Day, 1981, he's 12 years old, and he's playing with his friend, Eric Wolfgang, in his backyard. Suddenly, without warning, a massive sinkhole opens up beneath his feet. A 4 feet wide by 150 foot deep hole just collapses and almost swallows him whole. He is able to survive literally by hanging on to a tree branch that had been dangling over the hole before Eric can pull him out. So imagine that you're 12 years old, you're playing, and literally you almost get swallowed into the earth.
Nope. No, thank you.
Todd would later go on to tell the Philadelphia Inquirer, "The ground just started dropping. I went down to my knees, then my waist, and I just kept going down. I grabbed onto some roots and I was screaming for Eric. I couldn't see him and there was smoke everywhere. I heard him screaming for me to put my hand up and then he grabbed me. It was real hot and it stank and it sounded as though the wind was howling down there. That is absolutely terrifying." Todd survives, but he has nightmares about it for the rest of his life. He would later tell reporters that he would have nightmares about riding his bike and then the ground just sinking beneath him.
I mean, who wouldn't have nightmares after that?
I mean, it's something that doesn't even feel real. It sounds like something out of a disaster movie where all of a sudden you collapse into almost a pit. Todd's story makes national news. In fact, in March of 1982, he's on the front page of the Los Angeles Times, right next to a story about the U.S. opening up peace talks with the Soviet Union, to give you a little bit of a time capsule as to what's going on in the world. He's on the front page, and there's actually a great picture of him standing next to the hole in the ground where he fell through. And you can see, and we'll put this up on our socials and on the YouTube page, there's a giant plume of white smoke, of carbon monoxide and anything else you can imagine coming up from the ground.
This is pretty massive.
At this point, it is very much a public health hazard. And by this point in 1982, people are now realizing what's going on. By this point, too, the temperature of the ground is almost uninhabitable. In his first book, Fire Underground, The Ongoing Tragedy of the Centralia Mine Fire, David describes the temperature of the ground as worse than mercury. Not the element, the planet. That's how hot the underground was getting. Think about how wild that is. That the ground is literally burning and boiling beneath you.
I wonder, just thinking of the geography of this, I wonder if the town itself, the day-to-day temperature, I wonder if that rose at all comparatively to places around it.
I think it'd be a very interesting study to see what the climatology was.
Yes, thank you. That's a good word for it.
Because having that amount of carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide just kind of funneling out into the air can't be good for the environment or can't be good for the temperatures around there.
Yeah, what was the atmospheric conditions like? Yeah, that's crazy. My other question is, when did the residents really start to understand? Because like I said, this is 19 years in. When was there a mass exodus? Did they slowly start to leave? What happened to the residents of this town as this was happening?
That's actually I'm going to get to that in a second. By 1982, when Todd almost falls through the earth, I mentioned before, that's when the townspeople really start to notice what's happening. And by this point, it's already kind of too late. You have portions of the ground that are reaching almost 900 degrees Fahrenheit.
They didn't realize when there was carbon dioxide in the air or they started to have health effects or anything?
The health effects really didn't start getting reported until the 1980. This all happens in a relatively short time span. By that point, it is really kind of too late to do anything. And this also brings a lot of national media attention. People magazine does a story in 1981 about the fire, and they write, "Even the dead cannot rest in peace. Graves in the town's 2 cemeteries are believed to have dropped into the abyss of the fire that rages below them."
Like, that's insane.
Because one of the town's 2 cemeteries was actually sitting on the edge of the mine. So the cemeteries are now literally dropping into the earth. What happens then is almost unprecedented. In 1984, Frank Harrison, who's a representative in Congress from Wilkes-Barre, proposes legislation which Congress then approved, which allocates more than $42 million for relocation efforts to basically move the town and move the town people. Most of the residents end up taking the offers and moving. A few families opted to stay. Something I'll bring up a little bit more later is that there's a conspiracy theory for them, for the people that stayed, as to why they didn't leave.
I always knew that there were a couple people that stayed behind. I didn't know what the reason was, other than it was always presented to me in any documentary I watched about this, that almost like they were stubborn and they weren't leaving their home no matter, what offer they got or if they paid them. And I don't know if that's accurate or not.
But in 1992, Bob Casey, who was the governor of Pennsylvania, invokes eminent domain on all the properties in the borough and condemning them. The residents that stayed behind try to get this reversed, but they fail. And in 2002, the Postal Service actually revokes their zip code, which I didn't even know you can do. By 2002, Centralia doesn't exist. I don't even know what would go into revoking a zip code. I've never seen that happen before. By 2009, Ed Rendell, he of the wearing plastic bags on his head because of a football game.
Hey, he loves his Eagles, all right?
Just don't ask him for his views on China. He begins formally evicting some of the remaining families. By 2010, the remaining families actually file a lawsuit in federal court claiming that they want to evict them because the coal is so valuable underneath them that it's all a conspiracy by the coal companies to get the coal.
That's a little nutty.
Well, I was going to ask you, because I know, Laura, you bring up a lot of conspiracy theories on our episodes. What do you think of that?
I don't know. I think that they, like I said before, I think that part of the reason was they wanted to stay in their homes, and maybe this is just one excuse that they could think of to kind of, I don't know, block out everything else.
It almost makes sense to an extent, because I understand that coal is extremely valuable. I mean, it's some of the most valuable coal in the world. And so I understand that there are a lot of companies that would love to get their hands on it. Coal doesn't do anything if it's on fire.
And I just keep going back to, at this point, how many years into this, that they didn't understand the health effects of it. And regardless if they wanted the coal or not, like you said, yes, it was on fire. But 2, that's not the bigger issue here. So I don't know. I guess I could see it, like you said, in one respect, but it sounds crazy.
The lawsuit goes nowhere. They lose their lawsuit in 2010, and they lose the appeal in 2012. Finally, in October of 2013, the state and the families reach an agreement. Basically, the 5 people left in the town, literally that's the population, 5, would be allowed to remain in their homes for the rest of their lives. However, they could not pass the property down to any children. Basically, once they died, that would be the end of the town. The houses would be knocked down, and the town would become fully abandoned. In the last 10 to 15 years, it's almost become a tourist attraction. With the rise of its with its infamy on the internet, people would actually go to see the steam rising up out of the ground.
It's funny you say that because I actually had a friend that had like tossed around the idea of going up there and asked if I would be interested in going. And it's like, no, I don't want to be even near this town in any proximity. Again, just the chemicals and the health effects, like, no, thank you. That's just no.
It's also kind of wild when you see pictures of the buildings that are left in the town, that basically the homes that are left have these giant, they basically call them buttresses, to keep the buildings upright as the ground kind of crumbles beneath them. Now, the families tried to argue that the town was safe because the temperature at the ground had decreased significantly. Now, the government did admit this, but they also said that that did not mean the fire had been extinguished. It just meant that it could have moved lower down into the earth, where just natural vents and aquifers in the earth can provide it with the oxygen it needs to grow and to linger. In fact, it was Maurice Goddard, who was the Secretary of the State Department of Environmental Resources back in 1977, who wrote to someone who asked about it, and he said specifically, mine fires are most difficult to extinguish by merely cutting off the oxygen supply. Faults, fissures, and unusual geologic conditions often prevalent in the anthracite area are all factors contributing to this problem. Mine fires have been completely flooded for extended periods, and when dewatered, the fire soon reappeared. The only certain method of an extinguishment is complete excavation of the burning material, and this is an extremely expensive undertaking. So you kind of see what the problem is. You can't really get at the fire until you literally just completely excavate it and pull out the parts of the burning. What made this worse is, I mentioned before, remember I told you about the different arteries, the roots. When the mine had closed before the fire, you had something called bootleg miners. And that is exactly what it sounds like. Basically, people that were sneaking in, creating their own vents and their own passageways to bootleg coal, just like they bootlegged alcohol. This created even more oxygen flows and even more vents for the fire to go down. Eventually, the fire actually spread to another town called Burnsville, Byrnesville.
I was gonna say Burnsville. That's quite apropos.
That town also had to be abandoned and completely leveled. Now, the last part of this, there are differing theories as to what the actual cause of the fire was. Most people believe it was the trash fire that started all of this. And David Decock, or David Decoke, I guess, his theory is that the borough's deliberate trash burning to clean up the landfill in the former strip mine ignited the coal seam below an unsealed opening in the trash pit. That's his theory. Now, Joan Quigley, who wrote a book in 2007 called The Day the Earth Caved, she theorized that the fire had actually started the previous day on May 26th, 1962, when flaming trash was transported to the mine and dumped there. So her theory was that the trash was already on fire when it was left at the mine. Her reasoning for this is that the minutes for the town meeting from June of 1962 noticed that firefighters mentioned putting out 2 fires, and they submitted bills for fighting 2 fires at the landfill area. To be fair, David Decoke had basically debunked this theory, or not debunked it, but said that it's highly unlikely that happened. And his theory maintains that the borough did not seal the mine, and that therefore, when they tried to burn the trash, that's how the fire started. There's another hypothesis and kind of a local urban legend that the fire was actually spread from somewhere else, from a mine explosion that happened in another town in 1932. That one, to be honest, would be more reasonable to me because of how long the coal can burn. That was more reasonable to me than they transported garbage that was already on fire and then put it in the ground.
Yeah, that seems like that would be difficult.
Like, wouldn't you kind of know if the garbage is on fire?
Yeah.
Centralia councilman at the time had another hypothesis that it was actually started by a fire to the west. But again, the most reasoned hypothesis is that it started when the town tried to burn the trash. Today, as I mentioned, Centralia is kind of a natural tourist attraction. The state highway that ran through Centralia, that was later abandoned, became known for its graffiti on the pavement, and it became known as the Graffiti Highway. And people go to mark the highway, tag it, and also see the steam coming out of the pavement. But by 2020, that highway was covered up by the owner of the property and blocked so that no one could access it. Interestingly enough, because the extreme heat underground caused increased air pressure from the mine fires, that pressure interacted with heavy rainfalls to create Pennsylvania's only geyser. So Pennsylvania now has a geyser called the Big Mine Run Geyser, which is in nearby Ashland, Pennsylvania. It's used now primarily for flood control. And interestingly enough, if you've ever seen the movie Silent Hill, which is based on the video game, the filmmaker basically draws his inspiration for the town from Centralia. That's an abandoned mine town that became a ghost town because of a mine fire. And as we sit here today, the mine is still burning, and it's hypothesized that it could burn for another 100 to 250 years before it finally runs out of coal to burn.
Do you know, are there any residents still left as of 2024?
There are 5.
Still 5, okay.
There are still 5. But what'll happen is once the last resident passes away, their homes will be demolished by eminent domain, and that will be the official end of the town.
Were there any lawsuits that were filed in terms of town council negligence or payout for any long-term health effects, anything like that?
Not in my research, I didn't see anything that was related to that. The only lawsuit I was aware of in my research, and there may be others, please, if you're listening, and if I'm wrong, please let us know. But the only lawsuit I'm aware is the one that the remaining residents filed to try and stay in the town.
I would just think that at least the state of Pennsylvania would pay for any kind of like health treatment that former residents needed. I mean, I get why they wouldn't do the current residents because they agreed to stay there. But for those that did leave that do carry some kind of medical condition because of this, like that they would compensate them for that. But I guess I'm not surprised.
Well, and they did compensate them for moving too.
For moving, but not for any health effects.
No, not that I'm aware of. And it's also kind of unknown how many people actually had health problems. There's not an exact number.
But they could have done research on that.
Oh, absolutely. And you had 2 very kind of distinct divisions between the town. In the People magazine piece, I mentioned there's residents that think this was all a conspiracy to get them out of their homes so that the coal company and the state could basically just get that very valuable coal, which is not far-fetched, unfortunately. But then there was another woman who was pregnant at the time who was interviewed, and she said, I don't want to be in a town with toxic gas that's harmful to newborns and pregnant women. So you had people kind of running the gamut, and that's why most of them took I think it was like $212,000 at the time to basically be relocated. And think about how traumatic and how disruptive that is, for people that had probably grown up and spent their entire lives in that town to then have to leave the home they've ever known, because it's not safe for them to be there anymore.
It's funny that you say that because a while ago I heard the statistic about Pennsylvania that it retains most of their residents, like people that were born in Pennsylvania tend to stay in Pennsylvania. So that makes sense that they would want to stay in their town, and maybe even generationally, like we talked about, their families lived there.
Well, and also too, I think you combine that with people who grow up in small towns tend to stay in the small towns. They tend to have children in the small towns, and they tend to die in the small towns. They pass down their homes to their children and their children's children. I can even understand people not wanting to lose that. But at what point does the risks outweigh the benefits? At what point does the risk to your health outweigh, the continuity and the security of home? And to be honest, I don't know the answer to that question. I think only the people that stayed or the people that left would know that.
And I think it speaks to a broader issue too. As you were talking, I was just thinking about how it's so representative of humans sometimes and how we treat Earth. Like, it just felt like we created this massive issue with these climate implications, and then we just abandoned it and said, fuck it, we can't fix it, too bad. And God only knows what implications it still has for the climate. You know what I mean? Like, it's not surprising, but it's sad.
Well, and also too, I mean, by one article in 2018, this is one of 38 mine fires that are actively burning in Pennsylvania.
Just in Pennsylvania.
Now, other states did not mine coal as expansively as Pennsylvania did. It's just that Centralia has become famous or infamous for being a ghost town. And it's very much kind of a sad story and sad comment on just a lack of foresight, a lack of vision, and really residents who were failed by their elected officials and by corporations. That's really the story of the town.
Would you ever go there to check it out?
I've seen the pictures. That's fine.
You're good.
It would be very weird. And I think the state tries to discourage people from going as much as possible. I think they go out of their way to make sure that people aren't going there to kind of gawk or to put themselves in harm's way for a photo op.
But people are going to do what they want to do.
I'm sure there's at least one TikToker who's posed in front of the steam.
Probably. So what do you think the lesson is here?
Well, one, don't burn garbage in mines. And I think the other lesson is you expect better from politicians. You expect them to make decisions that are going to be best for the community that they're serving. Now, again, we will never know what truly happened, why the fire started. The idea that they intentionally set the trash fire to burn it, that's probably the most likely scenario, but there are no notes of that, and there's nothing confirming that. All we really have are just theories. Even if that's so, the lack of foresight to not make sure the mine was sealed with incombustible material, to not make sure the garbage wasn't on fire before you dumped it, to not burn the garbage in the first place, which wasn't a good thing anyway. It's a failure of government at the civic level, which is where government is supposed to be its most effective. Government is supposed to work at the hyperlocal level.
It's supposed to, but on either side, whatever party's in charge, it seems like more and more that's not the case.
No, and this is a great example of dooming a town for minor aesthetics because they did not like how garbage looked in the mine, and they wanted to make it look nice for Memorial Day. I would have loved to go back in time and figure out what exactly they were thinking and what exactly they thought they were going to accomplish. I don't necessarily know what burning garbage is going to accomplish in the first place. That's not really healthy either. With that said, we want to know what you think. What do you think is the reason for the mine fire? Would you go there? Let us know at our Gmail, on our socials, Instagram and TikTok. Let us know in the comments on the YouTube page, because we're going to be posting this episode to YouTube shortly. And give us your thoughts. We always want to hear from you, and we love hearing from you.
As Tom mentioned, find us on our socials at the Tell Me About Podcast. And our YouTube channel is Tell Me About Podcast. So we will be back in 2 weeks with another episode. And we hope you guys have a great week.
Bye, guys.